Garedan mesmis titkos swims, katadadis, magidaze. Del nelavīts lepšanas epiks, vits nav žortīgs, nāc vi mārze. Vicitami sacheben gis, chelšiva trialep cital zontis, gariš ražse. Titi dangam moco virgins, da uoke belchits, bajo ciele de dami caze. Vēl pikro broma ramišaus, šeni sahelits ptišaus, čerde pičem tismarto, squarze. Nerom vituli napičeps, šeni sit pomagišeps, procesel dačem tvis, camireps.
Welcome to Reimagining Soviet Georgia. My name is Brian.
And I'm Sokpo.
And today we have a very exciting episode and discussion with Severyan Dyakonov. Severyan, thank you so much for joining us. Introduce yourself. Who are you and what do you do?
So my name is Severyan Dyakonov. I'm a history postdoctoral researcher. I'm affiliated with University of Fribourg, Carleton University, and Geneva Graduate Institute. I did my PhD on Soviet influence in India, and I'm kind of turning this thing into a book, and this is my big background project now. And from my PhD thesis, I work on a new project on Soviet Red Cross activities abroad. So it's about Soviet hospitals that were mainly in Asia and Africa. And I'm also working on the International Red Cross Film Festival that was hosted in socialist Bulgaria during the Cold War.
This was a socialist health conference?
It was an international film festival supported by the International Red Cross that was initially started by Bulgarian Red Cross, but then there was so much support from Geneva. So it was one of the main media events of the International Red Cross that was during the Cold War in socialist Bulgaria. That is already very specific and interesting. And I'm hoping to make a big project out of it.
Could you just tell us a little bit about what is the Red Cross and then what is the Soviet Red Cross?
Yeah, it's just for everyone, if you see someone who is from Geneva and then they tell you, I work for the Red Cross in Geneva, that could mean at least three different things. So the first initial organization of the Red Cross began in Geneva in 1863, the International Committee of the Red Cross. And then after some years, all major powers, they created their Red Cross societies, like in the Russian Imperial in 1867. So after the revolution, the Soviet Union had their own Soviet Red Cross that was kind of outside of the International Red Cross movement in 1920s until 1934. But during the Cold War, Soviet Red Cross joined the executive positions in the International Red Cross movement. They had their people living in Geneva, working at the headquarters of the International League of Red Cross, and they presented in the socialist world that the International Red Cross is not something Western-based, Western-oriented, or uniquely capitalist, but it's also our movement, and we are at the forefront of heading this humanitarian movement. And for that, the socialist countries and Soviet Union, especially, they wanted to redefine humanitarianism, to tell that it's not philanthropy aid, but something different. It has inside initially some socialist aspect in it.
One of the kind of key uniting frameworks in this great article that you wrote that I really enjoyed reading, which is called Resilience, Perseverance, and Sense of Diplomacy, the Soviet Red Cross in India, 1954 to 1963. Everybody go read it. You mentioned that the Soviet Union's engagement with the Red Cross internationally and then the development of the Soviet Red Cross did have this attempt to redefine humanitarianism, to move away from philanthropy into something else. So could you just give our listeners a little bit of an outline of how that looked, what that meant, and why they did that?
Yeah, well, that's the major problem of the whole Red Cross movement during the Cold War, that in this socialist perspective, Red Cross societies in capitalist countries, they were pretty much ideological enemies because they saw humanitarianism as philanthropy aid. And from the socialist perspective, seeing humanitarianism as philanthropy, that meant a trick. That meant the ruling classes, they were trying to groom the poor to make them an impression that they're taken care of. And philanthropy is this small operations, or for example, when the Soviets, they were always criticizing the West that they would send this humanitarian aid for a short period of time to some country and then leave. And that they created this feeling in these developing countries as if the global north, they cared about them, when in fact they didn't. So in socialist perspective, they saw philanthropy as something really bad. And for them, they redefined humanitarianism as long-term development aid. In one of the aspects of that was medical development. And like all of these Soviet programs that they really wanted to have, ideal Soviet program would have Soviet doctors coming on rotation to a place all the time. They like the Indian case is probably one of the most successful, and in Ethiopia, when there is a space for Soviet doctors that would come, work there, integrate in local medical community, and they would actually create like a medical school there and would teach local medical personnel. And they would also very much interested in publishing in local medical journals. Like Indian case is specific because India is probably and was the most developed countries among developing countries. They had big medical community, big network of cities, many medical journals where Soviets could integrate and publish, and that was one of the biggest part. I think what is one of the main heroes in all of my project is Nikolai Chikalenko, who was the first Soviet Red Cross representative that actually lived and worked in Geneva from 1962 to 1965. He was undersecretary of the League of Red Cross Societies, and virtually he was one of the main people in the whole movement. He wrote this book about Soviet Red Cross and its work abroad in 1977. And there he criticized the Western Red Cross societies for this philanthropy aid as something really harmful for true humanitarianism. I'm writing now an article about the International Film Festival, where the Soviets, they were kind of making opinion which films were showing this the real meaning of humanitarianism. And there was a film, Fighting Cyclones, that was made actually by the League of Red Cross Societies for Bangladesh, just seeded from Pakistan. And there's a very specific thing about Bangladesh. There's a really flat country, and when there is a flood, there are lots of casualties. And there was a program started by the Bangladesh Red Crescent Society and International League to mobilize local population villagers that would come and create like this 6-meter hills in the village for each village. And it was like precaution measure for cyclones. And when people on the ground understand why they should mobilize for this particular purpose, when there is no monetary exchange, they just do it for themselves, and there is this mobilization and understanding that this hills is helpful for their survival. That's the real humanitarian aid. And it's not just coming after flood, giving them food and then going away. It's creating a new system of security for them when everyone understands their role and they volunteer for working for such projects. Yeah, and I remember that Chikalenko, he was very much to support this film to get the best price.
This is actually quite important for our time being, because NGOs and all these kinds of interventions, so-called philanthropic interventions, are being, criticized worldwide for not really doing what they are supposed to do, right? Well, what they say, the purported, mission. And so, what could we learn from the sort of Soviet approach that would be useful for a lot of people today of what it means to act in sort of solidarity instead of this top-down scheme that we are very much accustomed to, especially in the past 30, 35 years?
The Eastern Bloc and all of these Cold War debates, they actually did a big impact on global understanding what is health, what is humanitarianism, and many things that we are more sensitive now to understand that health is something different. It can be commodified. There shouldn't be the same attitude as to some trade for simple goods. Health is different thing, and universal healthcare should be a human right for everyone. There are still debates, and probably Switzerland and United States are kind of odd countries in the West that have paid healthcare system. But in most of the world now, people understand that this is very simple. Universal healthcare should be there. But this understanding is a product of the Cold War, and there was a big impact of Soviet Union being in international organizations and promoting such vision. So I think there is this value understanding of health now that is uncredited to Cold War debates. So like firstly, things are not that bad now. At least there is this thing, and then there is still this continuation, as you were saying, this top-down approach of philanthropy aid, and there is, but at the same time, maybe there is this lack of understanding that long-term aid and creating local communities is crucial. But there is no other side in the debate stack. There is no big Eastern Bloc to support it. And there is no social ideology inside of International Red Cross movement. But it looks like there is China that is working on its own. It's not very active in international organizations, but they do have these development programs. And it seems they continue the same system that the Soviet Union set when the groups of doctors come to Africa and stay on long term and try to teach local medical community.
In your article, you mention two very interesting things. One of them is that from the 50s onward, the Soviet Union became the leading voice of the International Red Cross. You also mention that from the 1920s onward, that the Soviet Union, after being established and having a few years of development, goes from being a net importer of medical aid to an exporter of medical aid. And they end up actually, through the development that comes in the first few years, being a state that's able to actually help other countries. And then there's one other component that kind of connects the domestic processes in the Soviet Union with its role in this shaping of humanitarianism and becoming a net exporter of medical aid, which is the role of women. And this is a big part of your article, which is that women end up becoming a very critical, if not the dominant, part of society that's actually in the medical field, and that the health minister of the Soviet Union, Maria Kovragina, who comes up into your article, who advocates for women's rights, protects the right for abortion, and she's actually very important in these processes. So I'm laying out all of this to say that there's this domestic process going on in the Soviet Union, the revolution, a kind of form of socialist development that then shapes how the Soviet Union engages in its medical practices in a place like India. So could you just maybe talk about how those two things connect?
Yeah, it's like I like time that I work on, that it's not theoretical debates on what socialism was, but it's already time when we have a generation of people that completely grew up in the Soviet Union, that had all their schooling in socialist system. So in 1950s, we have this 30-year-old professionals that are completely from a different world than anyone else at that time. So all of these ideas about liberation of women and giving them access to labor of the 1920s, now by 50s, we actually have the actual product of it. And we have a lot of professionals in the Soviet Union who are, I am my Soviet Union, and I'm myself in many ways enemy to my research. I wanted to maybe give a quick anecdote. I immigrated to Canada in 2009, and we had this courses for immigrants where people would just explain what are new realities in Montreal and Quebec. And there were images of people in casual clothes, and you had to guess which profession they had. And there was a lady, I know, in her 40s, and they showed several professions. It was like a quiz, and I thought, well, she looks like a doctor, and I put it that it was a doctor. And then they showed that there were how many right responses there were, and there was only one. It was only me who guessed that she could be a doctor, and it's not just to show off that I was so sensitive or something. It's just because of my own stereotyping, a lady, a professional in her 40s, probably she could be a doctor. Why not? And when I was doing my research, my PhD, I worked on first Soviet professors that came to India in 1960s, and they established chairs of Russian language in Indian universities. And I didn't pay any attention to this. And then I presented it in the United States, and people asked and who these professors were. And I said, well, they were like women in their 30s. And they asked, what, you mean like women? And how many of them were women? And I said, well, all of them. Why it's so surprising? For me, it was like a professor of Russian language in 1960s from Soviet Union. In my mind, it was most likely a woman. Why you have to pay attention to it? So there was this normalization for certain types of professions in the Soviet Union from the 1960s until, I guess, now, that a doctor, it's in most cases it's a woman, a professor in language, in the philology, biology, in chemistry, it's very, very likely that would be a woman.
And sorry to interrupt you. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you mentioned in your article that in the 1950s that there was pushback from the West against the Soviet Union because of the amount of women that were incorporated into the medical profession, that they were saying things like women should be at the home, not in the professions. And you mentioned this in your article, actually.
Yeah, there was a commission in the United States Information Service in 1950s that was evaluating Soviet materials and American materials for India. And they were discussing what's going on. There were American professors and scholars of South Asia, and they were seeing that there are these Soviet women coming. There are lots of materials from Soviet Union about women, and from American information materials, they didn't really speak about it, and there was still this 1920s criticism of women in the labor force, as that Soviet economy, socialist economy, was that weak that it couldn't provide women with what they wanted to have, is to stay at home with their children. So they forced women to work because it's just too weak economy that it's not able to do what people really want to do. So by 1950s, when there were so many actually women professionals coming abroad, and it was the new reality for the West, like this 1920s, 30s criticism of socialism didn't work. But I saw these materials in like end of 50s in America that still continue the same narrative. But by 1960s in America, they changed it. They definitely started to adapt to a new reality. Well, and it's internal American modernization that worked as well.
Yeah, I wrote a little bit about healthcare in Georgia recently. I started researching it more because we did a study about how horrible the situation is now and comparing it. And someone wrote to me on Twitter, I think he was an American, as I recall. He said he had traveled to the Soviet Union in the 80s, and it was his first time ever seeing a woman doctor. And he was like blown away by this. And it's really interesting how so many things we take for granted. Like I had never doubted in my mind ever growing up that women weren't doctors or professionals, because my family were all professionals and physicists, women, and doctors, women, and so on. So it's fascinating to me how for them it's such a novel idea, you know?
Yeah, and then at the same time, there could be some reversal now in this post-Soviet space when there is this promotion for ideal situation for women is to stay at home as well. Well, I don't know if there was this shaming of housewives in the socialist bloc or not, but it looked like there was some sort of this, if you don't share your labor, if you don't contribute to community with your work, it's something like bad. And there was this some moral judgment about women staying at home as well in the Soviet Union.
I'm okay with that. I think I think that's not really the fundamental problem, because there are plenty of housewives as well. And I think actually the most amazing thing is that even the most like warm family women also are have jobs and are professionals, or were, you know, so they can really sort of balance, or at least maybe not balance, but they could do both. And most women I know like love their job. Like I don't know any person from the Soviet Union, you know, who's alive today and they worked in the Soviet Union who said, "Oh, it was terrible that I had a profession. It wasn't a housewife." Like that, I have never heard this in my life, you know? So I'm not sure how much of a problem that really is, you know, like a palpable problem.
I just wanted to maybe to add that there's just very interesting thing at Carleton. Professor Dominique Marshall, she's a historian of Canadian humanitarianism, and she wants to work on this Cold War years as well. And there was a very specific thing about women doctors in Canada, like in developed world in this 1950s, 60s, that they felt this oppression, like this masculine domination, that they could not proceed in their careers. They could not get like a bigger project that they wanted. And these women, they actually wanted to go to decolonized world for doing these big projects, to be like this head of big research and be able to do something really on a bigger scale, and not just to stay in a smaller hospital in Canada. So there was this dynamic as well.
I think one of the most important topics that we really haven't discussed that much on our podcast, but really would like to, is that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, women's world really shrank. Their public life got completely destroyed. They were all forced back in the home and working, trying to sell things here and there, you know, in all these kinds of ways they were trying to make money to survive because of the catastrophic collapse. Most of them yearned for their professional life, to go to work, the respect that you had, the co-workers that they loved, you know, group excursions to, you know, conferences and so on and so forth. And so their world became very, very small after the collapse. They lost their co-workers or their jobs often because they completely destroyed those jobs. They didn't exist anymore. There was no necessity for most of those jobs. They got more and more folded into the family without having those kinds of bonds, those friendship bonds and classmates and co-workers that they used to have, or even like other things that they used to be able to do and afford to go to the movie theater or whatever. So actually, the collapse of the Soviet Union was also a collapse of most people's public life, I would say, especially women, but also men. But men, gathered out in the streets, like by the building outside, and still talk to each other more than women.
There is this, well, definitely there was this importance of that question that was always there in socialist and in Soviet foreign policy when they were creating these friendship societies between India and Soviet Union. Indians, they made up this Indo-Soviet Cultural Society that grew rapidly from 1950s to 70s, that became like a really large civic society network with over 1,000 branches all over India in the 1970s. And when Soviet diplomats, they were working to create this network, they were saying we always need to have women's section in every branch. And there was some criticism on the Indian side that it's not necessary, or it would be hard to make. But they were saying that there should be this open door for women always. It was like it was part of the program, and they could not, not have it there. So, first of all, there was this ideology, and the second, there were actually Soviet women working in all of these programs that had the sensibility to promote it and not forget this thing. But there is a lot of criticism that in this socialist system, women were professionals, and at the same time they had to do all the home chores, and all the family was on them. But they were professionalized people. It was a reality that there were thousands of people in the 1960s that had higher university education and professions. That was unprecedented to the rest of the world in the year 1960.
You kind of mentioned that there were these moments of cultural tension in these Soviet aid projects in India. But more interesting, I think, for me was that part of the framing in your article about Soviet-Indian relations is that India obviously was a state that pursued non-alignment, and through the pursuit of non-alignment, that meant that when Soviet aid was actually being applied and developed in India, it received these mixed reactions. So on the one hand, you have part of the society that says, yeah, we're not aligned, and so we need to develop and deepen these ties with the Soviet Union. But you also mentioned how the part of Indian society that was anti-communist, skeptical of the Soviet Union, had a political orientation that was opposed to the domestic, very large, very deep communist movement in India, would either create roadblocks or would perceive the aid in a negative way. So how does Indian non-alignment and the Cold War basically influence and shape the Soviet-Indian relations inside of India through these aid projects?
Yeah, that's a very big question. I actually was thinking, and I need to make a better backup for this argument, that I think Indian non-alignment is basically it's not a product so much of international relations, but it's more a product of Indian internal politics, of the Indian internal situation, that they had a big part of the population that wanted socialist reforms, and there were already a big part of Indian capitalists and people with big resources that were very pro-American, and the central government, they had to balance all the situation. And in like how Soviet scholars of the time in 1950s, they were telling, we don't see that Nero and his elites, they are kind of tricking us out, that they're calling this socialism and they're kind of hiding their capitalist intentions. It's not what is happening. What we see, it's the actual political situation developing. We don't know what the future would be. They don't know, nobody knows. And when we are there present, on a daily basis and we're doing our programs, we are influencing them day by day towards socialism. And it's just like, it's not, I think it's not, it wouldn't be fair just to say that there were these Indians that were just wanted aid and they played on this Cold War resource bases from United States and Soviet Union for their own benefits, as if they always knew back in their head that capitalism would win and they would just need some medical aid for their for their needs all the time. No, I don't think it was happening. I think people really didn't know who would win in the year 1960, what would happen. And socialism would just, Cuba just became communist, and it was really a big threat in the United States, and nobody was, joking about it, that like in 30 years Soviet Union would collapse and everything will be all right. It was not, nobody said that. So the Soviet Union, they called non-alignment as the progressive force of history. They were seeing this with big optimism, and they actually wanted to it was from early 50s that they stopped helping only communist parties abroad, but they tried to create this big international popular front of anti-imperialist movement that would be really broad. That was the same sort of idea as Popular Front in Europe in the 1930s when Nazi came to power in Germany. And all of this non-alignment network potentially could be part of it. And Soviet Union sort of wanted to tell that they didn't want military alliance with them, but they wanted to have this channel of ideological alignment of independence from world capitalist system. And for Soviet socialist economy, it was crucial to have as many economic ties with developing countries to create this larger network for socialist economy and not to be surrounded by this dominant capitalist world.
In your article, you mention how there was a difference between Soviet hospitals and Indian hospitals, but the difference that you highlight was quite interesting, that the Indian hospitals had a more symptom-based approach to treating patients, and the Soviet hospitals that developed had this more holistic and research-based approach to medicine. And this reminded me of how, I really like to go to the gym and work out, and I like to sometimes watch Soviet trainers talk about health. And in the 80s, and some people who actually are still living that were kind of interested in exercise in the Soviet Union, when they talk about health, they talk about things like, we don't like to isolate muscle groups. We like to use kettlebells, that are holistic full body workouts that actually do functional movements. And this was something that was like actually embedded in the whole Soviet idea of health. I also remember watching a great documentary about Soviet hockey, where the hockey players from the Soviet Union would go to the United States or Canada and have a hard time integrating into the teams because the philosophy of the coaching was so different. The Canadian and the American hockey coaches would be more about specialization of each position, whereas the Soviet squad actually had this more fluid way that they would play the game. They would all kind of like go in between on the ice. Everybody had to pick up the slack. They had this more holistic approach. And so that was the first thing I thought about when I read how you described the difference between these kind of post-colonial Indian hospitals and the Soviet medicinal approach.
They didn't want to, the Soviets, they didn't criticize Indians in particular. They were criticizing this British built system that there is a symptom, then you get medicine, and then you have a patient cured. So the holistic approach, it was really part of the socialist understanding what was health, that health is not just absence of disease, but there should be a condition for health with network of medical facilities, and there should be regular checkups of everyone before disease occurs. So like there should be this medical network available always for everyone, and people should come sometimes just to see if something is okay or not, and not when there is the problem that is already there. So in this idea of health, they meant that there should be this network supported by special kind of understanding how economy works. And of course, this understanding meant more socialism than anything else. So there should be this universal englobing, overseeing state that's kind of taking care of everyone, but you can see that nobody could be left alone, and this individualism out of this state system is kind of neglect for poor people. So they should be always in this security situation. They are having access to medical facilities. Actually, what is interesting that the definition of health by World Health Organization, that it's not just absence of disease, but it's a social condition. It was already adopted in 1940s, and then it was reinforced in 1978 at Alma-Ata conference that was in Soviet Union. And I think because of a lot of these socialist countries push to rethink and redefine what health was, and to bring the socialist values to it. There was also a parallel understanding, not only to health, but in the same logic to peace, to world peace, that peace is not absence of war, but it's constant struggle to have it. So it's not just actual combat, but everyone should kind of work on for peace every day and think about it, how not to let war happen. So there was always this universalist idea behind socialism that was basically incompatible to Western idea of humanitarianism, and they always clashed.
You know, from my research, it's like health, when they started thinking about health, like you said, they considered the whole ecosystem of health, which was, where do you live? Your house needs to be decent. You can have sunlight. You can't have noise pollution. You know, you can't, whatever, things can't fall on you when you walk by. You have to have a certain amount of whatever sleep, good air, and so on and so forth. And so the creating of socialism was not just like health, but it's like all these other things of being educated, having good sleep, good bed, good house, you know, plenty of exercise, rest, a very important part of rest, and so forth. And so when you go to another country, so in the Soviet Union, okay, you're building all this, right? This whole ecosystem, this whole chain of preventative prophylaxis, you know, healthcare. But when you're going to India, say, for example, and you're making interventions in countries that don't have any of these sort of chains, you really are just kind of stuck on this immediacy that's there of how to take care of a patient or so forth. But you're a little bit locked in of what you can possibly do without an entire system of having not someone that's not only sick, but also doing well, physically healthy and so forth. It's like, how did they navigate such difficult conditions of not being able to holistically create a society for better outcomes, but like being very much tied to a very small, hospital sickness that's a very small part of someone's health.
Of course, they couldn't do that too much. I think what they could do is just to have this access to that understanding, to socialist understanding of health. And in India, there were a lot of curious and left-oriented people, doctors who were, I think, communist and who wanted to have materials from Soviet Union. And knowing that there was a team in Delhi, they could at least write to them directly. And one of the big parts of the Soviet doctors' team was to answer questions, answer queries from all over India. So at least they could tell that there is this book published on that subject, and it's just to promote this other understanding of health. What they could do is just to teach people. The teams in Delhi, there were like 12 people, 20 people maybe maximum, Soviet doctors per year, and they could not have big presence because that would raise questions as if Soviet Union is too much in the country, and they wanted to keep this aid actually not that visible, but visible to knowledgeable people in the medical community, so that everyone in the Indian medical community would know that there are people from Soviet Union. You could actually come to them and talk to them and ask them a question what was going on in Soviet Union. And in some way, India was a lot more open and had a lot more information than other countries. Like there is a researcher on Brazil, for example, in 1960s, there were like doctors in any country, they are interested in everything what's going on in medical sphere. And Brazilian doctors, they didn't know what was going on in Soviet Union because books from Soviet Union didn't come. So the French Communist Party helped them. They were buying these books for Brazilians, for these left-leaning Brazilian people who would carry these books in their bags, ship them from France to Brazil in 1960s and distribute them hand by hand. And it was completely different situation from India, where there was books exchange. Soviet Union would translate books in local Indian languages. They were published in India or would come from Soviet Union. And Indians, they ideologically, and they were a lot more freer than Brazilians in 1960s. So they couldn't do much, but at least they could provide this information about other vision of medical care.
I'm curious about the Indians who went to the Soviet Union and then came back, because there's a part in your article where you talk about some that had gone to Tashkent and had gone to these non-Slavic regions of the Soviet Union and then came back, either medical professionals, and obviously there's a lot of literature now about other people in the cultural sphere, political sphere who were going to the USSR. How does that fit into your story about the Soviet-Indian medical relationship?
Yeah, that's big part of these programs is to create these ties with very concrete people who were called friends of the Soviet Union. And from at least mid of 1950s, they specifically wanted to have this left-leaning people who were not publicly communists, because if you were telling that you're a communist and having medical profession in India and would go to Soviet Union frequently, that would raise a lot of questions about your neutrality in the Cold War, and that would not help to distribute all this information. So people who would say that they're just friends of Soviet Union, that would be curious about medical progress in the Soviet Union, they were kind of the best candidates for these programs. And the person I'm talking about is Shayla Paul. It's a very interesting lady who was a doctor, one of the first pediatricians in India, and she was probably one of the most important people at that time in end of 50s, 1960s. Soviet Union used Tashkent and Uzbekistan as this forefront, ideal, modernized socialist society that had Islamic background. And I have this picture when Shayla Paul comes to Tashkent, and she's greeted by this lady who is teacher of English at the university in Tashkent, and she's having this very fancy dress and looking very modern for that time, and kind of representing this socialist modernity in yourself. So there was from 69, I think, it was International Film Festival in Tashkent that Rosen Jaglov worked on to promote socialism to countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So Tashkent was always like a place for having people from the global south to showcase them merits of socialism. I didn't work on later years. It's just it takes a lot of time to go further. I didn't see much of ties in like around 1962. There was something maybe like 200 Indian students in Soviet Union, but the number grew rapidly. 200 in the beginning, and then there were thousands at the end of 60s, and I think it's like in 1980s there were a lot bigger numbers, but until 1965 there were just really a few people that had this channel. One of the most important organization is Indo-Soviet Cultural Society that began in 1940s, and by 1960 they had like around 100 branches, and all of these leaders of that organization, they went to Soviet Union, and they were promoting this socialist and communist book materials, and Soviet embassy, they published a journal that called Soviet Land that I can't find in libraries, and I really want to. That would just tell what the news about Soviet Union, and especially in education and in medical profession.
That sounds amazing. Does Tashkent have like a lot of archival work that you can like look through to see? There's conferences and things that you can like find.
I haven't been to Tashkent myself, but I saw quite a number of people in Switzerland and Italy, in Britain, that went and recently went to Tashkent, and they were saying good news that recently it became easier to see the documents. It's just for these kind of exchanges like Soviet Union and India, they would do events in Tashkent, but the actual documents would be stored in the Russian State Archive in Garf in Moscow at the moment. So like there were lots of things happening in Central Asia, but it's not necessarily there's a substantial trace of archival data, but just my impression. I have not myself can't research Tashkent. You can go, and there are many things. I think on the level how the Soviet Red Cross was organized, like each republic had their own branch, and Uzbek Republic had Uzbek Red Crescent Society, and they should have archives in the state archive of Uzbekistan, and there should be much information on that. I was in India and worked in Indian National Archives, but it was very hard to find the same amount of information that there was in Moscow. And when Soviets, they were making these exchanges, they were doing it through Soviet Committee for Cultural Ties or Soviet Friendship Society, and all of these archives are at Garf in Moscow. But on the Indian side, in the Soviet Culture Society was a civic organization. It was not part of any government. It was not part of any political party. They had headquarters in Bombay at that time, in Mumbai. And it's not clear where there are archives for them, unfortunately. Yeah, so it's easy to work with socialist countries because they have such good archives for everything they were doing, and they're so well categorized. And if there is a relation with Congo, it would be a line in the archive that Congo for 1965 gold, it's there. Whereas for the other side, it's not the same. And for American Red Cross archives, it's not that, or Canadian, it's not that easy to work.
One theme that we like to always reference in this podcast is about memory politics. It's a recurring theme. And I'm curious, in your research, when you went to India, did you interview anybody who participated in some of these Indian Soviet initiatives? Or on the other hand, did you interview anybody from the Soviet side who participated in these initiatives that you're studying? And I'm curious, like how they personally remember the Soviet Indian interaction on the ground.
Yeah, I didn't I didn't see them. I really wanted to work on the beginning of the relations for 1950s, and like I assumed they were not alive, all of the my heroes of my research, but the people who worked on that in 1980s, they exist. You could potentially have contact with them. I didn't try it. It's just very hard, and it's like I think you have to decide that okay, I'm going to do that, and I want to prepare these interviews, and I want to see 5 people, and it would take so much time of preparation. And when you are in India, it's like I had my archival work, and I knew that I have my archives opened, and just I couldn't spend my time. Unfortunately, yeah, I think it's a big drawback of my research, but I just had like my impression of talking to Indians about what were relations between Soviet Union and India back then, that they kind of missed that situation, that they had a friend and then it disappeared somewhere. They were like wondering, where did it all go?
Well, I would say I work with some Indian health professionals and doctors today around healthcare to make healthcare free for all and better and so on. And especially on social determinants of health, it's like the modern speak, which is very much a socialist and a holistic approach of what makes health. And it's not just the intervention, the medical intervention. And there's still such a thriving community in India with around health and access to health, just like there also is in South Africa and a few other countries that are the world's leading champions of access to health for everyone in the world. And so I'm very happy that Soviet Union got to contribute to some of these movements that still, despite losing the Soviet Union, not having that kind of support or even a pressure to make anything more socialist, these movements to some level are still continuing, maybe not as thriving, but still going.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that it's important always to highlight that it was not just Soviet aid that made this socialist perspective in India happen. It was local Indian homegrown socialist aspirations. The problem of Soviet Union, all of this aid, that it failed to deliver on the same level. It's like, for example, they didn't have that many Soviet doctors that would speak English, for example, or that would speak other language for other countries, where French-speaking doctors from France or English-speaking doctors from the United States, they would come to Africa, to these areas, and would just immediately have a lot easier access to patients, and just would communicate with people easier. Yeah, it's just to say that Soviet Union just tried to help left-leaning people that were already there. It was a local Indian situation, that socialism did not belong to Moscow. It was a global aspiration for development, that poor countries could get development without this capitalist stage.
There's a lot of stereotypes about the Cold War, about the post-war global order, and the Soviet Union figures prominently in some of these stereotypical kind of views. Either that the USSR was completely separated from the rest of the world by a Iron Curtain, or by some in a socialist bloc that had nothing to do with the rest of the world, or that it was completely integrated into the whole world or the global capitalist system in such a way that it couldn't be severed from it. But it seems like your research and the research of others is showing that there was these competing modernities and competing views of development, competing views of what kind of economies, what kind of nations people are going to build, and that the Soviet Union had a different one that did speak broadly to the global South. And so I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that, or how the Soviet developmental aid through medical practices, or through medicine, excuse me, play into that and illuminate this reality.
Yeah, because the big problem was that Soviet Union was a big military power, and it was socialist country, and anyone who had some sympathy for this socialist development, they could be accused of being like KGB spy in the worst case, and everyone was wary about it and was afraid of being accused of be kind of affiliated to some foreign big military power. And I think that's the nature of non-alignment, that people were saying we want socialist development, but we don't want to be part of some military alliance and part of future world war. But in medical sphere, it's very specific because it's kind of very hard to criticize. If a medical team comes to another country, it would be hard to tell that they're doing something wrong. If they're curing people, how could you tell that there's something bad about it? So it's like you could only get points with this. That was, I think, really good part of ideological backup for these socialist programs. But I think they never really came to the level they wanted to. Soviet Union, they had permanent hospitals only in Algeria, Ethiopia, Iran, Afghanistan, India, and Cambodia in 1960s, and they needed countries to officially invite them to come and to work. And I think there was a lot of this Cold War dynamics that did not let this happen, because there was a lot of American influence as well. So just with this medical development, Soviet Union, they had to be part of the world international organizations and part of International Red Cross to come and speak out and kind of come into this so-called neutral themes as health and medical aid and humanitarianism, and bring their understanding and bring to people to hear it. But it was not that easy, because it was always part of the Cold War debates, and that was like the Cold War in action, in understanding what was health. So what is important is that neutrality, it's like in the Cold War, from socialist perspective, it always meant that if you are telling that you are neutral, it means you are for this capitalist liberal economy. And in the position when the world needs development, you cannot be really neutral. You have to be, if you are of high moral standards, you have to be for socialist development.
de magla wars glaus šis achils gargaus garish rajze waqt bkhalitan namts khwars uqurebs astaus moydanze Garedan mes mistit koswings wanebeb tausnel nela pik standatan gadau diwar squate maze Vera perși fikeneb nici Gamousa de garniț Catadadis se umagi daze Veu picro promara mișaus Ženi sahelic ptišaus Čerde pičem dismarto Squaze Nerom vituli napičevs Ženi sit pomagiževs Proca se udačem tvis Camirevs La 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 Sachelis ptishas, Cherde pichem dismarta, Squaze, Leron litli napičeps, Šenisit pomagišeps, Proces sev dačem tvis, Zamīreps, lai.